Did you know he'll help you understand? Did you know always a right hand man? Did you know he's gonna make it clear? Did you know? Come on, listen here. Did you know?
Hello, welcome to the Did You Know Show. My name is Brian Green, and today's show is sponsored by Always Best Care Senior Services. We are the agency that never sleeps. Today's guest is so intelligent, inspiring. He has a center that just can't be moved. He is going to talk to us today about black women's role during World War II. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to my guest today, Gregory Cooke, or should I say Professor Gregory Cooke. He's been teaching at the college level for over 30 years, and he is just a phenomenal historian. Welcome to the show, Gregory Cooke. How you doing?
Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate it.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been teaching at various levels for more than 30 years. I've been teaching at the here at Drexel, where we are today. I've been teaching here. This is my second tour of duty here, actually, so altogether about 15, 16 years.
Okay.
I've taught at the Community College of Philadelphia. I've taught in the Philadelphia Public Schools.
Oh, wow.
So
you have a documentary, Invisible Warriors, and I just want to just kind of talk about it and really get into what prompted you to put this documentary together.
Okay, well, it's been a long journey. I've been, in a way, fighting in World War II for African Americans to get our story to the public for almost 32 years. But all of this started was about almost 32 years ago. I had a spiritual experience. It's the only way I can describe it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was spiritually compelled. Something got in me, wouldn't let go of me, and I was spiritually compelled to go to a place called Bastogne, Belgium.
Okay.
And Bastogne was the focal point of the World War II Battle of the Bulge. And so I eventually went to Bastogne. I go into the Martyson Museum in Bastogne.
Okay.
And for the first time in my life, I see African American soldiers in a diorama. And it just woke me up. And as a result of that experience, I started doing research about African American participation in World War II. I learned there were more than 1 million black men who fought in World War II, who were in the U.S. Army. More than 500,000 of them were in Europe. And as a result of doing that research, I also stumbled upon the African American women, the 688 Postal Battalion, who went to Great Britain during World War II. And their job was to sort mail for 4 million American troops in Europe. As a result of doing that research, I then stumbled upon the 600,000 African American Rosita Riveters. And these were women, and many of them are still alive, but fundamentally they were women who, African American women, for the first time, they went into government offices. They worked in factories, shipyards. They built airplanes. They manufactured ammunition. They did hundreds of jobs during World War II. And my mother, Ethel Rebecca Becky Jones Cooke, was one of those women. And I know very little about what she did during World War II, except I can say that when I was a kid, she used to tell me a story. And she told me the story multiple times. For some reason, it stuck. But I remember there was always a kind of pride about her telling me the story. And the story was that when she was 18 years old, she rode on her suitcase from Norfolk, Virginia to Washington, D.C. To get her very first job in the U.S. Patent Office. She was a clerk typist.
Okay.
Yeah. So she was part of that great migration of African Americans who moved around the country during World War II. And she was part of that generation who opened doors of opportunity for other African American women, subsequent generations of black women today.
Wow, if you just tuned in, we're sitting here, we have a great conversation with Gregory Cooke, and we're talking about the role of African Americans in World War II, specifically black women.
Yes.
So you've covered a lot of ground in like 5 seconds, so let me dissect that. First, let's start with the term Rosie Riveters. What does that mean? What is it all about?
Rosie the Riveter was an iconic symbol that was used to inspire women, and this was all geared towards white women. During the war, approximately 8 million additional women, overwhelmingly white, went into the workforce to help with the war effort. You have to remember that there were 16 million men in the military, and so as these men left America and were involved in the military, somebody had to take their places. And so the largest group of women who went to work during World War II were white. And so Rosie the Riveter is that iconic image. You see the woman, flexing her muscle with the bandana. Okay, and so the whole idea was to motivate women to come into the workforce because they were needed. And it was the first time in mass that American women actually went into the workforce in non-traditional roles. So my definition of Rosie the Riveter is fundamentally any woman who did traditionally men's work was a Rosie the Riveter. And although my mother was a clerk typist, you must remember that prior to the war, a lot of the jobs that we came to associate with women, filing, typing, those types of things, were actually held by white men prior to the war. And so when the war came, those men went into the military, and women from all over the country converged on Washington, D.C. in particular to take those jobs and keep the federal government running, the paperwork of the federal government running.
So what is the cultural and historic significance of African American Rosies?
Yeah, well, their significance is culturally and historically they're significant. As I said, they were the first African American women to have the opportunity to do non-traditional work. You must remember that prior to the war, more than 80% of African American women were basically relegated to being domestics or sharecroppers. The sharecropping was mostly in the South. And you also have to remember the sharecropping was really a 100-year extension of enslavement. And one of my Rosies actually says when you were sharecropping, you were in slavery. So historically, then, that was something that gave black women an opportunity to have jobs that they had never had before. And I'm sure had there not been a war, they wouldn't have had the opportunity then. And so that's part of their historical significance. It's also the same generation. They're the greatest generation, right? And Tom Brokaw, I think, coined that term, and he wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. I was going to buy his book. His book is that thick. But there's a paragraph when he talks about black people in his book, there's one paragraph like that of the greatest generation pertaining to African Americans. So these women are part of the greatest generation of the African American community. These women are also, so the jobs they had allowed them to have serious impact in the black community, helping their families, helping other people in the community. And you have to remember that World War II really is what really brought America out of the Great Depression. So everybody, or most people in America, were hurting economically, and black people were hurting even more. So the fact that these women, starting in 1942, were able to get these high-paying jobs, relatively high-paying jobs.
For the times.
Yes, for the times. Was extremely significant. And what was cool about it was there was nothing here to buy. There was rationing. So you get a paycheck, but you wound up really saving most of it because there just wasn't a lot of stuff to buy in terms of consumer goods and what have you. And so I think the biggest thing about it was it created economic opportunities, but it also dispelled stereotypes about women and gender and about African American people and women.
Okay, so we're here today on the Always Best Care show. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and continue our conversation with Gregory Cooke, Professor Cooke. He doesn't laugh. I'm picking with him. We're going to continue our conversation about African American women during World War II. Please stay tuned.
Did you know?
Always Best Care specializes in helping seniors who wish to remain in their home but need assistance. Our flexible care programs vary from hourly to live-in. Simply put, we're there when you need us. And Always Best Care is a DHS-approved Medicaid provider. Call today and we'll meet with you to develop a personalized care plan. Always Best Care Senior Services. doing more, caring more, and dedicated to exceeding your expectations always.
Did you know?
Welcome back to the Did You Know Show. We're going to continue our conversation with Gregory Cooke, Professor Gregory Cooke, and we're talking about the African American presence in World War II, particularly African American women. And then, Gregory, I want to get into what was the racial climate during World War II?
Generally speaking, the racial climate for African Americans was not particularly positive. You have to remember there was a lot of economic deprivation across America, and African Americans usually bore the brunt of that deprivation, and so you had generally you had high unemployment in America, and even more so in the black community. Now, when the war started, that began to change some, because all of a sudden you have to ramp up the industrial might of this country, and it changed things and created opportunities for black people. However, there was also a tremendous pushback across America about African Americans going into the military, as well as African Americans going into what we call non-traditional jobs, building airplanes, shipyards, etc. And often that resulted in a lot of racial violence. In 1943, for example, there were more than 300 race riots in America, and most of those were in the North and the West, and Northeast. And they were more or less directly a result of competition for jobs, competition for housing, competition for resources, as African Americans migrated from the South to the Northeast, to the upper Midwest, and to the West, where most of the industrial jobs were.
So let's talk about, so now you have the World War II going on. Women, a lot of white women predominantly, have gone into, then what was considered the non-traditional workplace.
Yes.
And now you have African American women also kind of coming into that workforce. How are they greeted?
Generally, it varies. So, for example, if you went into the federal government in Washington, D.C., what was interesting about that is everyone made the same pay. So if you were, let's say, a clerk typist and you were grade 2, everybody got the same pay. However, when it came time to getting a raise, that's where you start to have these differences. So one of the Rosies in the film, she went to the General Accounting Office during World War II as a clerk typist, and she talks about how the room was literally segregated. You had white typists on one side of the room, black typists on the other. Everybody was getting the work out of the same box. And she says, her name is Bernice Bowman, and she says that when it came time for a raise or an upgrade to go from grade 2 to grade 3, she said the white women got pay raises, got bumped up a grade. None of the black people did. But she said, we didn't like it, but there was nothing we could do about it. So that's just one example. You also had, for example, in Baltimore in 1944 at Western Electric, you had black women coming into an all-white department, and the white women who were in the department refused to share restroom facilities with the black women. They demanded that the management build separate restrooms. And when management refused, the white women went on strike.
Wow.
And part of this was because of myths about black women having venereal diseases and what have you. The irony to that is during the war, all the posters of showing women with venereal disease were white. And women, prostitutes, and similar types of women were considered a security risk during World War II, because if soldiers got venereal disease, it could knock them out of action.
Right.
So in Baltimore, getting back to Baltimore and Western Electric, So these white women went on strike. The military was called into Baltimore, and the army was in Baltimore for 6 months, maintaining law and order. Eventually, the strike ended when management decided to build separate restrooms. And you also have to understand there was labor unrest on the other side of Baltimore because you had black men working in ports.
Okay.
And, again, a new area. And so Baltimore was a hotbed of racial activity. Right here in Philadelphia, you also had the racial climate here was relatively hostile racially. PTC, now SEPTA, in August 1944, they hired the first black motormen, and the all-white union went on strike. And Philadelphia was the largest and most diverse war manufacturing center in the country. So you had things here like the Philadelphia Navy Yard, Frankfurt Arsenal, Quartermaster, Baldwin Locomotive. Across the river, you had RCA, for example.
Oh, wow.
So the all-white union went on strike, and the army was brought in. There was a riot here in Philadelphia, August 1944. The army was brought into Philadelphia, and the commanding general basically told the striking union members, "You have 2 days to get back to work, or you'll be overseas." And the strike ended, but the motor cars, the trolleys, and what have you, armed soldiers with bayonets stood behind the drivers. And this was the result of 8 black men getting jobs as motormen. And this was the kind of environment that black women and black people dealt with during World War II across this country.
And I seen the snippets of your documentary, and I remember very clearly that, okay, so if they were in D.C., they got maybe a clerk typist, but what about the women that went kind of, I guess, what would be considered the field, and did different kind of jobs out there? They got some of the most dangerous jobs.
Yes.
And really hazardous conditions. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Black women, first of all, were the last ones hired. Most black women didn't get their jobs until 1944, which was the last full year of the war. So it was a pecking order in terms of labor. It was white males. It was white males, white females, black males, then black women in terms of the pecking order of labor. And so, as I said, black women didn't get their jobs until 1944. But often they would get the most dangerous jobs. One of the women in the documentary, her name is Willie Mae Govan, and she was in Childersburg, Alabama. I know I'm not pronouncing that like an Alabaman, but and she made gunpowder for E.I. DuPont. And she told me, she said that the job was so dangerous that when they started processing the dynamite, the gunpowder, I'm sorry, she was sent outside to do work out in the field. And she said there were no white women who did that kind of work, right? And so she suffers health problems as a result of that today. And then again, right here in Philadelphia, the late Alice Amaro worked at Frankfurt Arsenal, and then she was transferred to Fort Mifflin here in Philadelphia. And she told me about how they were sent out, black women were sent out into a field out at Fort Mifflin to prepare boxes that I guess would hold ammunition and shells. And she said she looked around and saw that there were only black women out in this field. She sat down and went on strike. It wasn't her intention to start a labor strike, but she said, when I sat down, all the other women sat down with me. And they stopped working for 2 days until the supervisors decided, okay, we're going to send some white women out here to work with you. So there was the danger of the jobs, as well as there was sexual harassment.
And this is, I just started to say, as I think about that, you think about 1943, 44, this predates what is now known as the Me Too movement,
Yes.
or even the term sexual harassment wasn't really, wasn't really even identified.
Right.
And not just for black women, for white women either.
Right.
And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about, what was their work environment as women, what went on?
Well, Of all the women I've talked to, only one acknowledged sexual harassment. Again, that was Willie Mae Govan in Alabama. And I think she had the best line in my documentary. She said at that time in Alabama wasn't nothing free but a white man and a black woman. And she talked about how they wanted sexual favors from her to keep her job, and she refused. And she said some of the other black women did, some of them didn't. She said those who didn't lost their jobs shortly thereafter. But you have to remember, this was something that white women, all women, encountered. There were no laws, there were no protections, there was no such thing as sexual harassment. And think about it like this: if you have a boss who's a male, and maybe your husband was killed overseas, and you got 3 kids at home,
Right.
and he knows that, he can demand all kinds of sexual favors from you just to keep your job, knowing that you got 3 mouths at home to feed, etc.
3 miles plus yours.
Plus yours, yeah.
Wow.
So there was no redress against sexual harassment. But again, like I said, of all the women I talked to, only one actually acknowledged that she was a victim of sexual harassment.
Let's talk about the one of the other things I found interesting too was the uniform. At that time, women mostly wore skirts, but
Right.
then coming into the workforce, now they had to wear pants.
Right.
Let's talk about that.
Well, working around machinery, you can't have your hair out, you can't have skirts, you can't wear anything that could get caught or snagged in machinery, which is where the bandanas came in.
Oh, wow.
Okay, you have to tie up your hair, right?
Right.
So that was part of it, and then also many of these women went to school for training to be a welder or sheet metal worker, and so that's when you started wearing overalls and boots, and you started dressing like a man basically.
What was considered dressed as a man, because
Yeah.
pants.
Yeah.
Because back then the tradition, or the lay, if you will, was women wore skirts,
Yes.
and blouses, and men wore the pants.
Yes.
Hence now women are wearing the pants.
Yes.
And that connotation kind of also connotates the fact that they were also the breadwinners for the household at that time.
Yes.
And so we're going to continue to come. Let's take a quick break.
Okay.
There's a lot of information to cover. I'm sitting here. You're watching the Did You Know Show. Today's show is sponsored by Always Best Care. I'm having a conversation with Gregory Cooke, adjunct professor at Drexel University currently. We're going to come back on the other side and continue our conversation with Gregory Cooke. Stay tuned.
Did you know?
Always Best Care specializes in helping seniors who wish to remain in their home but need assistance. Our flexible care programs vary from hourly to live-in. Simply put, we're there when you need us. And Always Best Care is a DHS-approved Medicaid provider. Call today and we'll meet with you to develop a personalized care plan. Always Best Care Senior Services. Doing more, caring more, and dedicated to exceeding your expectations always.
Did you know?
Welcome back to the Did You Know Show. Today's guest is Professor Gregory Cooke. He is breaking it on down about the African-American participation, if you will, in World War II, particularly African-American women.
Yes.
And when we left off, we were talking about the uniforms. Women now had to wear pants, and that was kind of a cultural change for the time.
Right.
I want to also mention, and I want to get a little bit of how we were counting, because when you do the statistics and you do the analysis of the how many people participated in World War II as soldiers versus African American women that actually held down jobs, non-traditional jobs outside of domestics and sharecroppers, the number is not always accurate, because back then we weren't particularly counted correctly. And it's my understanding that black people or people of color, we weren't pretty much a part of the census in a lot of ways, and so as a result, we had to write our names down in a Bible. The family Bible kind of tracked, our family and our heritage, and it was also my understanding too that there were certain restrictions in the South that a lot of women could not travel without a husband. For instance, they couldn't. My mother even says, my mother always tells me stories, and my great-grandmother always tells me stories. You couldn't leave South Carolina as a black woman unless you were married. And so, you have all of these different obstacles. And it's interesting when you talk about census current day, at least from my perspective, you have all of these questions, the controversy over whether or not, citizenship questions should be on the census and that kind of thing. So in our own way, we've come a long way to being counted. And I just want to highlight that, because you never really can get a complete accurate accounting of how many people of color, participated as soldiers in the war, and then how many black women actually went into work during the war. So when we get back to the conversation, I want you to, if you can, if you don't mind, talk about the Double V campaign. What was that about?
The Double V campaign was started in January 1942 by the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, which was possibly the preeminent black newspaper in America.
Oh, wow.
And it was started because a young black man wrote an editorial to the newspaper basically asking the question, why should I go off and fight for America when many of us cannot vote, we do not have equal rights? Why should I go off and fight for America? And so as a result of that, the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier came up with this idea to start the Double V campaign. The Double V stood for victory over Nazism and fascism overseas, and victory over racism and segregation at home. And so it became a rallying cry, if you will, for the African American community during World War II. So in essence, African Americans were fighting a war on two fronts. And there was a certain degree of hypocrisy about what America was doing, because on one hand you're saying this is the center of freedom in the world, and we're going overseas to fight Hitler and other totalitarian societies, while at the same time you're doing the same thing. For example, you're doing the same thing to African Americans here that was being done to people in Europe, particularly Jews in Germany. And so there was a certain amount of hypocrisy there. Many of the black men, if you came from the South, in all probability you could not vote. And so Marion Reed, one of the women, talked about it. 3 of her brothers went overseas to serve in the U.S. Army.
Okay.
But she said when they came home, they could not vote. Her parents could not vote. So, and she described it as a tragedy. So the Double V campaign brought all these things into focus for black people in terms of what we were actually up against and fighting for during World War II.
Let's talk about, during World War II, the nurses and the WAC. What was that about?
Well, again, World War II was the time when all these opportunities opened up for African Americans. Keep in mind, I don't think it was really altruism. It was like, it was just
out of need?
Yes, it was out of need. First of all, with the Rosies, one of the things that happened with the Rosies in 1940, June, A. Philip Randolph, who was also one of the 2 men who organized the Great March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph called for a march on Washington in 1940, June. And he called for 100,000 Negroes to come to Washington, D.C. to protest against the fact that African Americans did not have jobs, were not getting fair treatment in America. And so word of that got to Franklin Roosevelt. And as a result of the pressure of A. Philip Randolph and Mary McLeod Bethune, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which opened the doors of opportunity in government offices and in industry. Basically what it said is, if you are getting a government contract for the war effort, and we were not yet at war, but if you were getting a government contract, you must hire women, you must hire people of color, otherwise you won't get the contract. And so that was the big thing that opened the door for the Rosies and other black men. As for the WACs, which stood for Women's Army Corps,
Right.
Again, this was a time when black women got an opportunity they would have never had. So during the war, approximately 6,000 black women went into the Army as WACs. Major Charity Adams Early was one of the highest ranking black people in the military at the time. She was handpicked for her position by Mary McLeod Bethune. Major Charity Adams Early, Charity Adams.
Okay.
She took a battalion of black women overseas. It was the largest group of black women to go overseas during World War II, the 688 Postal Battalion. And they went to Birmingham, England, and they also went to Rouen, France. And their function was to sort and route mail for 4 million American soldiers in Europe and during the time they were in England, their job was also to sort and route mail to Great Britain. Some people in Great Britain hadn't received mail in 2 years before they got there. And when they arrived there, the mail was in warehouses literally stacked to the ceiling.
Wow.
And they knocked that down in about 6 weeks.
And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about a little bit how let's just shift the conversation a little bit of how Jim Crow was imported into Great Britain. You did another piece.
Yes.
No, let's talk. Let's get there. Come on.
Okay. I did another documentary a number of years ago called "Chocolate Soldiers from the USA," and it's about the 140,000 African Americans who went to Great Britain, mostly prior to D-Day, what was interesting about Great Britain was they formed this unexpected bond with white Brits, and so, which was totally unexpected. But as a result of that, as you built up to D-Day, you had about 1.4 million American soldiers in Great Britain. Most of them were white males. And so often, wherever black and white troops came into contact with each other, there were fights. In some places like Bamber Bridge, Bristol, which was under martial law for a time right after D-Day, Leicester, there were actually shootouts between black soldiers and white soldiers in Great Britain. So the army because the army had imported Jim Crow to Great Britain. Again, there's that contradiction where, we're fighting against Hitler, and the Brits are looking at this like, wow, how could this be? We're fighting against Hitler and his policies, and the U.S. Army brings Jim Crow to Great Britain. And the sticking point in all of this was the fact that black men were dating and socializing with British women. The British civilians were inviting black men to church. They were inviting them into their homes for dinner. They were inviting them to dances. And of course, black men brought with them jazz, jive, and jitterbug. And this was a totally new thing that, for the Brits. So you had all kinds of fireworks and problems in Great Britain, so much so that there were 13 African American and Latino men who were hung by the U.S. Army in Great Britain for rape and or murder. And one of the most famous...
Allegedly rape and murder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the most famous cases involved a guy named Leroy Henry who was accused of raping a woman, and he had a trial. He was found guilty and sentenced to death all before lunch. And the people of Cooke Down, which is right outside of Bristol, they got wind of this because they knew this woman and they knew the circumstance. So within a few days, they had a petition of more than 30,000 signatures saying there's been an injustice done to Leroy Henry. They sent the letter to Eisenhower. Eisenhower got the letter on June 7th, 1944. He's occupied with D-Day, which started the day before. He gets the letter about Leroy Henry, and in one sentence, he overturns Leroy Henry's conviction, and Leroy Henry then is sent back to his unit, and he serves the rest of the time in the Army. And finally, and this happened in Great Britain and other parts of the world, we talk about the nurses. There were between 700 and 800 nurses. Keep in mind there were 50,000 nurses in the Army during World War II. There was a nurse shortage throughout the war.
Okay.
But fewer than 800 black women were allowed to serve as nurses. And the caveat for them was you can only treat black soldiers and German prisoners.
Oh.
Yeah. And also keep in mind during that time, blood was labeled black or Negro and white. And some blood actually had the person's name on it, who they got it from. Great story I learned from a nurse. Her name is, she's passed on, her name is Prudence Burrell. She told me about a story where a white soldier was brought into a black first aid facility. And they told him, they said, all we have is Negro blood. And if you don't get this blood, you're going to die. And so, of course, the guy said, give me the Negro blood, right? And he lived. And after the war, he was so moved by that experience, he went home and told his father about it. And because they knew the name of the soldier whose blood it was.
Right.
They found him and actually gave him a job.
Let's get back to Mary McLeod Bethune
Okay.
and Eleanor Roosevelt's relationship.
Right. Mary McLeod Bethune, in my opinion, is and I think many other people's opinions, is one of the. She was a giant. She was the daughter of former enslaved people, and she started Bethune-Cookman College in Florida. But Mary McLeod Bethune was good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was a primary agitator for the rights of all black people, but particularly for black women. And what was cool about her was she could pick up the phone and call the president. And she never had appointments. She'd pick up the phone and say, Mr. President, my people have a problem. You need to see me. And so she would go see the president and talk about these things. And of course, being friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, it also gave her further access to the president. But the two of them together, again, my read on Eleanor Roosevelt, I think if you stacked all the other first ladies on top of each other in terms of what they contributed, I don't think they would come up to Eleanor Roosevelt's knees. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was serious in terms of what she did for African Americans. She's the one who prodded the government to send the Tuskegee Airmen overseas. Right? She's the one who was also prodding her husband and the government to give jobs to black women in industry. So Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was in many cases his eyes and ears. She would go places he couldn't go because, he had polio, he was in a wheelchair. So Eleanor Roosevelt was all over the world, pushing the American agenda, but she was very good friends with the black community. And the people I talked to from that time, they all held Eleanor Roosevelt in very high regard. And one of her key moments, again, involved a Philadelphian, Marian Anderson. She was supposed to sing at Constitution Hall, which was the Daughters of the American Revolution. They would not let her sing there because she was black. And so Eleanor Roosevelt intervened. Eleanor Roosevelt also resigned her membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she got Marian Anderson the opportunity to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So Eleanor Roosevelt was a giant of a woman politically, historically, and she was a great friend of the African American community.
Wow. We are taking Professor Cooke's class today on the Did You Know show, and I am forever enlightened, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. Let's take a quick break and come back on the other side and continue our conversation about post-World War II and the climates then. Stay tuned.
Did you know?
Always Best Care specializes in helping seniors who wish to remain in their home but need assistance. Our flexible care programs vary from hourly to live-in. Simply put, we're there when you need us. And Always Best Care is a DHS-approved Medicaid provider. Call today and we'll meet with you to develop a personalized care plan. Always Best Care Senior Services. Doing more, caring more, and dedicated to exceeding your expectations always.
Did you know?
Welcome back to the Did You Know show. As I said before, we are sitting in Professor Cooke's class. He is giving it to us, in a way, in a really, really layman's term way, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
But let's continue the conversation about the black USOs.
Okay, during World War II, not only, World War II was probably America's finest hour, even, in my opinion, historically, I think it was America's finest hour, even though there were some dark spots in that. So it was the kind of thing where virtually everybody, every family had somebody somehow involved in the war.
Okay.
And so, one of the things black women did also was to manage USOs and Red Cross clubs around the country. And of course, they were segregated. There was a USO club around Broad and South here in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Right, and they were segregated. But the USO is where, soldiers and other military people would come to dance, relax, meet women,
Socialize.
Yeah, socialize. And so that was something that black women did too. And of course, you're managing a facility. And those were, again, opportunities that black women would not have had because of the war. Black women, black sororities were also involved in starting some of the first daycare centers
Oh, wow.
in the black community. Because, again, you have people going out to work in factories,
Okay.
and sometimes they needed daycare, particularly if you migrated to someplace, let's say like maybe Detroit or Philadelphia, where you may not have had a lot of family, extended family.
Makes sense.
You needed other facilities to take care of your children while you're at work. So that was something else that black women did. And then you also had two black women in particular who were involved. Hattie McDaniel, who was Mammy, Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
She was involved in bond drives during World War II. And raising money to help pay for the war. She was going around with, I think it was called the Hollywood Canteen, encouraging black community to buy war bonds. My favorite person, though, is Lena Horne. Yeah, Lena Horne was a pinup, and she was a pinup for African-American soldiers and some white soldiers during World War II.
Imagine that.
Lena Horne had this interesting story. She was to perform for black troops at Fort Riley, Kansas. And she comes out, and all of the front rows are taken by German POWs, and the black troops are behind them. And Lena Horne refuses to go on and perform because of that. And so her studio, MGM, I believe it was, took her off of the tour. And as a result, for the rest of the war, Lena Horne went around the country performing and entertaining black troops on her own money. And she was a darling of the Tuskegee Airmen. There's a couple of famous pictures. There's one famous picture of her sitting in the cockpit of a plane with black airmen around her, the Tuskegee Airmen. And she became an honorary Tuskegee Airman because of the work she did in World War II. So again, we have black women in different positions in America contributing to the war. I just want to give a shout out that there were two famous black women who were Rosie the Riveters. Ruby Dee worked at Western Electric in northern New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
And Maya Angelou was the first black person to work for the San Francisco Transit Department. And her story is kind of interesting because she would go in there every day asking for a job, and they wouldn't talk to her. So after a while, they would reject her or not talk to her at all, and she would go back day after day. But it got to a point she started taking her books, and so she'd just go in and read all day. And finally, apparently, they got sick and tired of her coming there, and they gave her this job, and she became the first black motorman, transit operator for the San Francisco Transit Department. So that's
History.
Yeah.
Let's shift the conversation about post-war World II. The soldiers come home. Along with that, black soldiers come home, white soldiers come home. And now what do? What happens?
Okay. Post-World War II was a real problem. America had not fundamentally changed, but the expectations of African Americans had changed. We had, sacrificed, we had shed our blood, but you're coming back to the back of the bus. You're coming back to a place where you cannot vote. One of the biggest injuries, in my opinion, of black troops who came back was most black soldiers did not get the fair share of the GI Bill. The GI Bill had two real juicy parts to it, right? The first part was you would get a free education, meaning you could go to college, a trade school, anything like that. Black soldiers who wanted to do that could go to an HBCU, right?
Right.
And so the GI Bill paid for that. But the other part to the GI Bill was you would get a real cheap mortgage, right? Real cheap mortgage.
VA loan now is what it's known now. VA loan now.
Black people were not able to get that. You had redlining in major cities, which meant that banks, because the GI Bill was a government program administered through private, organizations like local banks and financial institutions. And so, because of redlining, they did not lend money in the black community, and the newly created suburbs, which are largely a post-World War II phenomena, were off limits to blacks. And so they never got the opportunity to use maybe the juiciest part of the GI Bill, because as a result of that, the ability to get a house created wealth for subsequent generations of Americans that are still being experienced today. I have some students, and I sometimes ask them, do you have a grandfather or great-grandfather who was in World War II? And they say, yeah. I say, chances are that's somehow or another connected to you being at Drexel because of the wealth that part of the GI Bill created. And so that was one of the problems. But the black people who came from World War II, they were also the spearhead of the civil rights movement. So you had people like Medgar Evers, you had Ralph Abernathy, you had Fred Shuttlesworth. Icons of the civil rights movement were in the military during World War II. And by the time Rosa Parks decided to not get up, 1955,
Right.
the war had been over for 10 years. Now you're a fully grown man, a fully grown woman. And so these people spearheaded the civil rights movement. And so their legacy is huge. I think they are the greatest generation of African Americans, certainly politically the most significant generation of African Americans.
Let's talk about, one of the things I found very interesting in your documentary that I watched, as orated by one of the Rosie derivatives, was the fact that when her husband came home, the kids didn't know him. He was unable to get a job. In a lot of ways, she was the head of the household.
Yes.
So he had to reacclimate himself to the family.
Yes. It was, and this was an issue for not only for black soldiers. This was an issue for all soldiers coming home.
Right.
A lot of times particularly if you're a young guy, you going overseas, you marry your high school sweetheart. You're 18 years old. What do you know? And you're gone for 3 or 4 years. He was a little bit older though, but in the case, her name is Ruth Wilson. She worked at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She helped build an aircraft carrier.
Spirited too. Spirited.
Yeah. She USS Valley Forge. She's 97. Still plays pinochle on Thursdays, right?
And she's still here.
Yeah. Lives in South Philly. But her husband was overseas. Her husband went to England. Then he went into the European theater. From what she told me about him, I've kind of surmised he was in Gray's registration. Okay, which meant he went around and collected bodies. He also suffered PTSD. And she told me a story about whenever he would hear an airplane overhead, he'd dive under the bed, right? But the point was, when he came home, the young children didn't know him. He had been gone for 4 years. They had gotten accustomed to their mother working, paying the bills, taking care of the business of living. And so when he came home, he was a stranger to them, and their marriage eventually, fell apart, and that was not unusual. The divorce rate spiked after World War II into the early 1950s. So did the birth rate. I'm a baby boomer, but it was a difficult time, and you had all these pressures on black people, and we did not get, in my opinion, our fair share of what happened. As for the Rosies, many of them went back to domestic service after the war because that was all they could get. Okay. And things started to open up and change as we got into the 1950s.
Wow. So we're going to really benefit in this episode of really, seeing a snippet of the Invisible Warriors. I've seen it, and we're going to really work to get it out in the mainstream. Yes. But you have been gratuitous enough to share it with my viewing audience. Set us up. Tell us what your concept was in short, what it's all about. And then you said something too off air about the news back then.
Yeah. During World War II, I mean, if you wanted to see moving images of the newsreels, you went to the movie theater, and in most places, movie theaters were segregated. They had white theaters, black theaters, and they also had they had newsreels for white audiences, and sometimes newsreels for black audiences. So as a result, often black people saw very little of black service people, black troops overseas, black Rosie derivatives. And so one of the challenges in making my documentary, Invisible Warriors, African American Women in World War II, is to find the moving images of black women working in factories, shipyards, etc. There is some out there, there's very little, and I'm in the process of finding it. I know it's out there because I've seen it, but I haven't been able to find it yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you're going to share that. So we're going to end our show today with showing you, some snippets of the Invisible Warriors. Professor Cooke,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the opportunity to share this small part of American history with the audience.
You gave us more than a mouthful in this hour segment, and I just really appreciate you. Continue to share it, and we're going to get behind you and really seek a way to get the story of Invisible Warriors and Chocolate Soldiers out to the mainstream. That's it. That's my show. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the snippets. We'll call it the sizzle reel of the Invisible Warriors. This is Brian Green signing out. Again, I want to remind my viewing audience that I am on the radio on Saturdays at 4 p.m. on WURD Talk Radio, Black Radio. Check me out at 4 p.m. WURD 96.1 FM, 900 AM. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
We have always been loyal when the ideals of American democracy have been attacked. We have given our blood in its defense, from Crispus Attucks on Boston Commons to the battlefields of France. We have fought for the democratic principles of equality under the law, equality of opportunity, equality at the ballot box, for the guarantees of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Working at the Navy Yard made me feel patriotic, that I did something to help the cause. We were doing something to help the boys, and it just made you feel special.
When I worked at Eastern Aircraft, we worked the swing shift. If you worked the second or third shift, you slept most of the daylight hours. If you worked the first shift on weekends, there was something called, there was the USO.
It was a black USO here in South Philadelphia. I think it was around Broad Street. And we used to go there when the boys would come in from the camps, give them treats and talk, dance. I was home by 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and had to get up at 6 and go to work.
I met my husband at church. Bob was always a dancer, and I had learned from him. And we used to go to USO on the weekends to dance. Lots of servicemen were there. They wanted young ladies to come because some of the servicemen were alone.
The same thing that black women did, again, perfected in World War I, they used in World War II to show their patriotism, all right? To volunteer, to give blood, to work with the Red Cross, to create, to buy these bonds. It was a community coming together.
We had the Victory Garden, we bought war stamps. We had rationing books, and we were careful how we spent our books. Yeah, we did all the patriotic things, but nobody in my family actually wanted to go overseas to serve on the front line.
The country has asked the people to invest $1 billion in 1 month to help pay for the war.
And one of the most convenient ways and patriotic way was to take the war bonds. And I felt very strong about that. I saved those war bonds, and believe it or not, it was those war bonds that helped me and my husband to buy our first home. So it was patriotism and saving also.
My family was patriotic. I remember one time my soldier came to the house and he said he was hungry. Mama cooked and fed him. He was a white soldier.
Washington, capital of the United States, now the focal point of the free world of tomorrow. Here, American history lives in monuments to heroes who preserved our freedom. Here again, the battle for liberty is centered.
Washington was deeply segregated. A black person could not go downtown and use any of the restaurants or even the toilets and other facilities. And it was so segregated that you had the feeling that you were in a foreign country.
If we bought clothes downtown, in the stores they would wait on us, we couldn't try on anything.
They had a People's Drug store across the road from where we worked. And at lunchtime, we had to stand at the end of the counter, and the waitresses would wait on us in between, waiting on the others. And we would finally get our order, which we had to take out. We could not sit and eat. And therefore, I never ate at People's any other time. That was enough for me.
The whole issue of segregation was so real, even then, that many times there were different treatments for black women and other women of color.
It may seem puzzling that black women would be patriotic in the context of a racially segregated society in which so much blatant discrimination was occurring. The Double Victory campaign was the answer to this dilemma. Double Victory stood for victory against racism at home, victory against fascism abroad. The two were intertwined.
It was a consciousness-raising movement that really laid the foundation in black people's minds that we have to fight for our rights. This is something that we have to do for ourselves.
I feel like America belonged to me too.
Did you know always a right-hand man? Did you know he's gonna make it clear? Did you know? Come on, listen here. Did you know?
Taking care of my mother is so hard. All my life, she gave me the best care she could. Now it's my turn. I have to find my mom the best care.
At Always Best Care, our caregivers are matched to meet your needs. And we even give you access to on-call, round-the-clock physician support, along with your in-home care. If you need help with your mom or dad, call 1-302-409-3710 or visit alwaysbestcaredelaware.com.